The modern shipping used to protect our new airplanes makes it almost unusual for one to arrive with any damage. And the E-flite Valiant is no different in that it arrived in perfect condition. I still take the time to unpack everything and check it closely to be sure there's no hidden damage. This is also a good time to make sure that you have everything. When I pulled out the main landing gear, I found another little surprise underneath them. You also get the wire landing gear for mounting the optional float set. The more industrious guys are right now thinking about building their own floats. A couple of times a month I'll get an email from a guy with a plane that I've recently reviewed saying they didn't get an instruction manual. I can usually help the ones that haven't thrown the packaging away because it's more than likely still taped to the bottom of the foam insert. But some will just go on bad-mouthing the company for not sending them a manual. One of the first things I do on any electric plane is to take the prop off. I hear from more guys that either got nicked or had a close call because the motor started when they weren't expecting it with a brand new airplane. With the prop off, this would be a good time to make sure you've got the throttle cut set up correctly for this airplane. I take the time to bind the airplane to my radio and make sure the throttle cut is set up so it works. And even then I'll leave the prop off until it's ready to balance. We just don't need the prop on the airplane right now. Electric props often have a thin line of molding flash along the edges that acts very much like a razor blade. We need to balance these props anyway, so I lightly sand the edges until they're nice and smooth, and then I balance the prop. That adds maybe 30 seconds to the whole process of balancing, but it makes the prop a lot safer. With many planes, one of the first things I do is put the main gear on. This makes a lot of planes just more stable on the bench, and that's easier to work on. The next thing they tell you to do in the manual is to install the tail feathers. And we're going to get to that, but first I want to put the main wing together and get that mounted on the plane. I want to make sure that the tail feathers are lined up with the wing as they're supposed to be. The wing halves are reinforced by a pair of spar tubes that give you some strength, let it withstand some of the aerobatics a plane like this is capable of. The wing halves are bolted to the airframe using a plastic plate that goes over the top and actually holds the wing halves together. I just know that between flying, this plate's going to fall off and the wings are going to try and separate. So I decided to put a little packing tape across the joint on the bottom of the wing. It really doesn't need this tape to fly, it just makes me feel all better. Then on top of the wing, I use a couple of pieces of double-sided tape just to keep that plate in place when I'm not flying the airplane. And once I'm done with all these high-tech modifications, I use the included screws to screw the wing firmly onto the airframe. And this is a step that I think too many people just don't know that you can or should do this. We want to make sure that the horizontal stabilizer is lined up with the wing. To start this, we install the tail feathers using the recommended fasteners, but just not gluing anything down. Most ARFs use some kind of screw system to hold the tail feathers on, so we install them and make sure that they're good and tight so that the tail feathers are in their final position. Then we want to look from the rear of the plane with the rudder centered between our eyes. Adjust the height so that the tail feathers are just sitting on top of the wing or just underneath it. What we're looking for is that both ends of the tail feathers set down on the wing at the same time. If one side was higher than the other, you might have to put a piece of tape on the lower side on the wing saddle just to jack that side up just a little bit and then recheck it. I should note that all of the linkages were installed at the factory and all were correctly adjusted. We didn't have to make any tweaks before the maiden flight. Finding things this well adjusted isn't all that common, so it's worth your while to check all of the linkages and make sure they're installed properly and adjusted properly. This is the one aggravating thing I found on this plane, is that the extensions that come from the receiver to the wing are very short. That makes it very difficult to put this plane together by yourself without the wing hanging from these extension cables. After I establish these connections, I go back through and make sure that the Y cables are still firmly plugged into the receiver, because they can get pulled out a little bit by the wing hanging on them. This would be a great place for E-flite to add another 6 inches to these Y cables. Also, none of the wires are marked in the plane, so I had to go through and figure out which was which and put a little piece of tape on them. In the next segment, we're going to take the little Valiant to the field and see how it flies. But you're going to have to come back to see that part of this review. And we added a little performance demonstration to the maiden D, and you're going to want to come back and see that.